I entitled the class, Restoring Our Glory from the Inside Out. And today we're going to do something that I have been personally shying away from. It was a challenge for me personally, but I'd like to take you together on the journey of actually taking a close look at the book of Ezra. And the reason I say that I personally have been shying away from it is because for those of you who are familiar with the book of Ezra, it's pretty depressing. The imagery is pretty grim. The language is not so simple to understand, but there is a lot of beauty contained in Megillat Ezra, and I think we'd be cheating ourselves if we didn't give it its fair share, and today is its opportunity, as it is typically read on the 9th of Av. Good, bad. So just to give you a little overview before we take a look at any of the slides, I just want to give you a cliff notes about how the book is structured. And the reason I say that is because very often form follows function, meaning in Hebrew literature, the way something is expressed is equally as important as what it is that's being said. And the book of Ezra is comprised of 5 chapters. The first 4 chapters are all written in an acrostic format, meaning the first line starts with the letter Aleph and Bet and Gimel. That's acrostic. And then the 5th chapter just breaks the mold completely. We'll talk about that too. And rather than just talk about it, if we could have the next slide, please. I'd like for you to just have a visual so that you can see what's taking place in the Megillah. Beauty. Thank you. And so, if you'll notice the first, maybe I'll stand like this. If you'll notice the first, not so great. If you'll notice the first letter of every line that you have in the first chapter there, every first letter, if you check them up downwards, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Daled, all of that is part of the depiction of the acrostic style. But there are parts that I started to highlight for you. For instance, in the red, you'll see En la menachem. So maybe if we just read, let's hope this works. En la menachem means the city of Jerusalem has nobody to comfort her. I use the English word, she is hopeless. She's in a state of hopelessness. And then, when we look at the green writing, for instance, where it says, Hichshil kochi, lo uchal kam. The author of Ezra, which we believe is Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu, there are different versions, but we'll go with that today. The author is expressing this inability to even get up. So a person who's in a state with nobody to comfort them, in a state of hopelessness, where they literally don't want to get out of bed in the morning, we would describe that in today's terms, next slide please, as being in a state of depression. And we find ourselves, and now you know why nobody wants to read the book of Ezra, because it's hard enough to get through life, let alone read it, a couple of chapters that however your emotional state is, it's going to leave you more depressed. And so this idea, all these signs of depression are part of what we as a people are experiencing. So the poet will take us through what the city, how is it possible that a city is sitting crying and there's nobody to comfort her, but we're really just displacing how we're feeling and projecting it onto the city. And that's sort of the first stage of how the book starts out. But we should know something else. And I'd like to share this today. We live in different cultures throughout our history. And every culture and every country that we've lived in has had a lot of different influences on us. So today, I'd like to highlight the influence that the children's literature has to us as a nation. And I don't mean for this to be anything childish. I mean to say that the messages that we remember from our childhood as adults are most likely remembered because they have a message that is universal, a message that is transcendent, a message that is something that speaks to the heart. Next slide, please. And so I brought for you a simple nursery rhyme. And we're all familiar with this nursery rhyme. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall, he has a great fall, and no matter what we try to do, all the king's horses and all the king's men, who doesn't know the end of that story, they can't put Humpty Dumpty together again. And why is it that even as adults, yes, the words rhyme and it's catchy and it's cute, but there's a subliminal message in this simple little nursery rhyme, and I think the book of Eicha is speaking to this. And it's saying when we fall, and we're depressed, and we're broken, you could get all the king's horses and all the king's men. They're not going to be able to put us together again. I think what the rhyme is trying to say is, why can't they put him together again? Because the only person who could put us together again, individually, personally, or as a nation, is going to be ourselves. It's going to have to be some kind of a strength that comes from within. Next slide, please. And so the next slide is going to show you once again how we have our acrostics. The letters are going from A all the way down in order. There's going to be a little variation, and you'll see it with that little blue, wait, I have a laser here, which isn't working. Okay, forget that. See that little blue guy? That little blue arrow? It happens to be that the pattern breaks. And instead of going from Aleph to Taf in complete perfect order, there is a change. And the change is intended for us to pay extra close attention to letters that are flipped. It's Samech, Ayin, Pei. That's how the letters normally go. But here in our acrostic, it's going Samach, Pei, Ayin. And again, I always say this, the text doesn't have many ways for us to pay attention to it, for us to give it extra notice. It doesn't have bolding and coloring like we have here. It can't make its letters bigger or do anything impressive for us to notice it, but it could do this. It could play this little trick on us and say, I'm not going to fall into line. As letters, we're going to, you ever read The Day the Crayons Quit? It's a great book, you should read it, another children's book. But anyway, the letters themselves have an ability to play this little trick. And we have to notice and see, what is it that they're saying anyway? Why would they stand out of line? Why would they go out of order, so to speak? And so they say, Patsu alayach pihem. The peh, the letter peh sounds like mouth, a peh. The letter ayin sounds like ayin, which is the Hebrew word for eye. The mouth and the eye are going to start to play tricks on us. And it's going to start first from an external place. And the book of Eicha is now going to write the narrative for what other people have to say about us, which is going to be why it's such a depressing book. And we'll see what happens at the end. But for now, Patsu alayach pihem, kol oivayich, all of your enemies. You know what they say? Ach ze hayom shekivinu, hip hip, hooray, these are our enemies. This is the day we've been longing for. This is the day we've been hoping and praying and yearning for. What is the day they've been yearning and praying and hoping for? for the day of our destruction, for the day of our demise. This is how the Peh is going to react. And then it says, Asa Hashem asher zamam, exactly what he had said mimekedim from the earliest days. And he had no mercy on us. And so what's happening in this second chapter? Megillat Echa is sending us a very strong message. It's saying, do you know how this happened to us? Do you know how Yashva Badad, do you know how this nation turned into this desolate place? Do you know how? Because we were listening to the voices of whom? All those external voices, all the voices of the naysayers, all the voices of the people who said, I don't think you could do it. Those are the voices that you were listening to. What voice should we have been listening to? Well, the text is going to tell us very clearly. I'll take the next slide, please. The voice that we should have been listening to isn't the voice of our enemies. And we should have listened to either God's voice who warned us, we should have learned from our mistakes, or we should have listened to our own internal voice. And so I'll take the next slide, please. This is now the third chapter. This is as cliff notes as you're going to get for the book of Echa. The third chapter does an interesting thing. Oh, next slide, please. The third chapter, if you see, I only put it up here. I didn't expect you to be able to read all of the words, but I just wanted you to get a visual so you have some kind of familiarity with what the book of Echa is and what it is that we read today. So it does AAA, BBB, CCC. It does all the letters. Instead of being 22 verses, it's 66 verses. But basically, what does it say? I pulled out a couple of pisukim, and when I wrote, I cry me a river, I wasn't being sarcastic. Palge mayim tered. My eyes will literally let down, bodies of water will accumulate from my tears. And then we say, ad yashkif, vireh Hashem mishamayim. So what's our plan? We see that the city is stuck in destruction. We see the devastation around us. Our enemies are dancing in the streets. Sound familiar? And what do we say? What do we do? In the third chapter, we decide we're going to sit and cry. And what are we going to cry? What are we going to do? What is the focus of our hysteria? We're saying, God, wake up. It's time for you. Ad yashkif, it's time for you, God, to look down from the heavens. It's time for you to do something about the mess that you made. It's about time that you fix the situation that we're in right now. I'll take the next slide, please. Anybody familiar with the Lorax? When I say that children's literature in our culture plays a very strong role, it plays a strong role because there are messages that sometimes need to, or really always need to be delivered when we're young, when we're still in our formative years. The messages that we send our children, the messages that we tell ourselves, those narratives that we speak in our head. If we grow up believing that everything is going to be done for us, don't worry, honey, I'll tie your shoelaces. Don't worry, honey, you dropped your ice cream, I'll get you another one. Don't worry, and I'll take care of everything. If the parent is going to say that, what kind of child are we going to raise? We're going to raise a child that when something goes wrong, they're going to do what? They're going to cry their eyes out, waiting for who? For mommy or daddy to fix their problems. But here, it's starting to tell us, and the Sefer doesn't show that there is a ray of hope at any point. We're in the middle of chapter 3. We'd hope by now, in most of our literature, if you read even the Haftarot, any reading that we do on Shabbat, we never leave the reader, we never allow the reader to walk away depressed. We always have, always, there's a message of hope. We'll grab a couple of Pesukim from a different book if we have to, and make them an appendage to whatever it is we're reading, just so we could say what? So we could say, don't worry, at the end, everything's going to be okay. The book of Eicha is not telling us that. The book of Eicha is saying, be careful the messages that you allow your children. And we are God's children. And so there's a message here for that as well, and we'll touch on that in a couple of minutes. Next slide, please. And this, if there's small children in the room, you may want to cover their eyes. I made it as G-rated as I possibly could, but the actual Hebrew, if you understand it, my interpretation, if it upsets you, I'm sorry, I made it as light as I could. This is chapter 4. Chapter 4 reads like a page out of the Holocaust. Chapter 4 says, our crown has fallen, and the precious stones are strewn about. Ateret roshenu, the crown from our head, and we need to talk about the imagery in a minute. But then it goes further, and it says, those that once feasted, they had lavish parties and lavish feasts. What's happening to those very same people? What are they consuming now? They're scouring the trash, the garbage cans, to try and find scraps to be able to eat. And do you remember before, when we were feasting on all these delicacies? Do you know what's being feasted on now? I'll let you read it so it's not so horrific, but it's pretty grim. They're feasting on their children. And then, if you remember after World War II, when the language says, look, suru, suru, al tiga'u. You know what happens when we try to find refuge in other places? You know what all the other nations tell us? Suru, suru, you are toxic. Don't come near us. We don't want you here. Your clothes is all soiled and bloodied. Why would we want you? This is chapter 4 of Eicha. This is what we have become. If we're able to read it, and maybe one day now that we got a cliff notes of it, we'll go into it in a little more depth. But they used to wear clothing that was spun with gold. They had crowns on their head. And now there are people who nobody wants to even come close. They don't want us to come close to them. And this is what our current situation is. Next slide, please. This is the 5th chapter of Eicha, the 5th and final chapter. You'll notice there's no rhyme or reason. The letters are all doing whatever they want to do. There is a tiny rhyme, and that is that there's exactly 22 verses like all of the other ones, so it falls into a pattern, but the letters are all like we are at this point. They're scattered, they're confused, they don't know their place, they don't have a place, they don't know who they are, they don't know their name or where they belong. And this is what's happening here with these Pesukim, and it's pretty tragic. And we pray for God's mercy here. And we say, Hashem, please, see. And again, this is a very, what's the word I'm looking for? It's a very painful language to see. Again, our closest reference that we have to a devastation and a destruction was the Holocaust. You read this, and it sounds exactly the same way. Our houses were taken over by strangers. We have no way to get bread. Our skin looks like an oven. I mean, you can't really get more horrific than what we're reading here. We're in a state of starvation. Our young daughters, you can read that for yourselves. The young boys hanging on trees. I mean, it's pretty grim. And what happens? What do we say? Ki im ma'os me'astanu. You know what you did, God? You rejected us. And since this is the 5th chapter, maybe we should take another tiny little minute to say, wait a minute, that's the last verse. The last verse is saying, God, you rejected us. Kafatzta aleinu ad me'od. I think you overdid it, bless you. I think you went too far. Kafatzta aleinu ad me'od. You really, really unleashed your fury on us to a point that we can't even tolerate that. There are a couple of pesukim here, and I put them in red because I needed to give them their fair share. Nafla ateret roshenu, oina lanu ki chatanu. We do say, we recognize ki chatanu. It took us a while. We're at the end of the 5th chapter, but we did sin. So please, Hashem, please restore your place together with us and seat yourself as in your throne for us. Hashivenu v'nashuva. You know those songs that we sing, Hashivenu v'nashuva. We're saying, God, take us back and we will return. And it sounds beautiful when you sing it in a song, but the reality of it is that the Sefer doesn't end in hope, because as long as we think that the Yeshuah, that the salvation is going to come in this order, Hashivenu v'nashuva, that first, God, do what? What are we asking God to do? God, we're asking you, thank you, to take the first step. You bring us back, God. Send us a limo. Send us a plane. Send us salvation, and then what? And we'll come aboard, and then we'll come, and we will join you once again. That's a problem. So when we read the book of Eicha, we start to understand why is it that there's no hope at the end of the book. Because it's not intended, this is the intention of the author, is to deliver a very strong message. As long as these Pesukim don't say, Nashuva, we are going to return to you, God. Please accept us. We're going to change our ways rather than sitting and crying ourselves a river. Rather than lamenting, it's called the Book of Lamentations, rather than lamenting over what is, until we can write a book that tells a story and paints a picture of what will be, what we plan to do about it, how we plan to change. So until we can write that book, then we're stuck reading the book of Eicha. I'll take the next slide, please. And so basically, this is just a small recap of what we've spoken about. The way the book of Eicha is structured is it has poetry on one side, neatly ordered, everything beautifully structured. And then on the other side, in its neatness, what is it depicting? It's depicting chaos, grief, and confusion. And I put these up together on one slide because it's very rare that we won't have, to some degree, these two sides coexisting. We rarely ever have in our lives only violins and flowers and rainbows. There's always going to be, I hate to say it, but get used to it. This is the way life is structured. There's always going to be some element of chaos in our lives. There's always going to be some element of grief in our lives. These emotions coexist. And the challenge is going to be for us to find some type of calm in the chaos, for us to find some type of order when everything could possibly be falling around us. And it doesn't have to be in extremes. It could be the smallest thing. But if you don't realize that this is part of the story, and you think that this is an aberration and you're supposed to only have rainbows, why is there a fly in my soup and everybody goes crazy? We have to realize that that is part and parcel of the whole picture. I'll take the next slide, please. So this language that we use, next slide, please. So this language that we use, it's from the 5th chapter of Eicha towards the end. It speaks to, again, a universal attitude. And it's an attitude that needs to be eradicated. I'm bringing this pasuk not because it's the ideal, but because it's a symptom of a disease that brings destruction. This kind of attitude, Avotenu chat'u ve'enam, ve'anachnu avonotehem savalnu. Our fathers sinned, and they are gone, and now we have to pay the price for their mistakes. Again, do we want to sit and cry a river? Do we want to say, wow, the state of affairs is whose fault? Somebody else made a mess. Why do I have to clean it up? The whole idea that this is somebody else's doing, is somebody else's problem, that I'm not responsible for this, this is what gets us into this mess in the first place. And so, I'm ready for the next slide, please. My daughter-in-law Simone helped me with this. This is a whole psychological part of it. I'm not that smart. She said I shouldn't mention her, but I asked her to please tell me in psychological terms how the mind works and what it is that brings us to a point that we start to believe that things are outside of our control. So first, we broke it down. And we say, well, what are things that are really outside my control? There are a lot of things that I don't control. There are a lot of things that I can't control. I can't control other people's feelings. I can't control other people's opinions or other people's actions. I can't control other people's mistakes. And I can't control adversity. So, accept this. This is a part of the way the world works. There are things I control, and there are things that I can't control. I'll take the next slide. As if I'm whispering. Now, these are things that we can control. And this is so elementary, I feel silly even making a slide and put it up there. But sometimes when we're down in the dumps, we need to be reminded that, you know something? I do have, and again, when we're in a state of depression, when we're in a state of hopelessness, what do we think? We think there's nothing that can be done. I can't do anything. I can't even get out of bed. I can't even tie my shoes or brush my teeth. How do you expect me to do anything? And then we have to be reminded that, you know what? I'll quote Viktor Frankl, I can't control what other people do. He said it in a much better way than I'm saying it now. But I can control how I react. And so even though there's a lot of things that I can't control out there, I can control my attitude, my effort, my behavior, my actions, which speak exactly to the book of Eicha. Yes, your temple was destroyed. And yes, it doesn't look, I'm not going back on any of those slides because we don't even want to revisit the horror of them. But can I move forward? Can I have an attitude that says, I recognize what happened and I want to change because of it? I'll take the next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. This you could tell is not me. But I want to teach you a terminology. I learned it this week, and it's become my mantra the entire week. And it's called locus of control. We have to ask ourselves constantly, what degree of control do we have over the outcome of events? It sounds so simple, but it's the whole story of Eicha. What degree of control? If we are people who have a tendency, who are oriented towards having an internal locus of control. What does that mean, internal locus of control? It means that I believe that I control my own destiny. How simple is that? And if I have an external locus of control, it means that I believe that my destiny is at the hands and at the whims of other people. I know it sounds so silly and so simple for us sitting here today, but when we are faced with destruction and devastation, there are two roads that we can take. And the book of Eicha is begging us and saying, please, make sure you don't fall into the trap of this, the word locus, location, a place, a pinpointing. Where is the place of your control? It's begging us, please, I'll take the next slide. Don't fall into the trap of the external locus of control. Don't fall into the trap that says, next slide, please. That says, we can't, and we can't. Whatever it is, que sera, sera. There's nothing I could do about it. It's not in my hands. This type of narrative is a destructive narrative. We have to change this narrative today. Ultimately, what are we doing here today? Why are we even fasting? We need to listen to our gut. When it says, feed me, that we could hear. That voice we know how to hear. We have to start to learn to listen to our gut when it says the right things that are going to build us, that are going to change our situation. So if we are going to fall into this trap, I put here, we are just puppets. We're nothing, we're nobody. We don't have the ability to act on our own. What we really need to develop, I'll take the next slide, please. What we really need to develop, again, anything I ever needed to know I learned in kindergarten. It's a great book, by the way, also. And the truth of the matter is, why do we remember this? Is anybody here who doesn't remember the little engine that could? Why do we remember this so many years later? It speaks to our inner voice. These stories are speaking to our greatest self. It's speaking to the self and saying, you could be better than even you think you can be. But what has to happen? The king's horses and the king's men can't tell you to be better. What has to happen for us to become the people that Eicha wants us to become? It has to come from a place within. I'll take the next slide. I don't think I have to say anything. I think this is all pretty self-evident at this point. The place we want to be is not people who put their trust and hopes in something outside of them, because that will lead us to a place of fear and anxiety. Why would we have anxiety? I'm not in control. I'm a wreck. When are we most wrecks? When we can't control the situation. We have to hope for the best. Rather than do that, what should we be doing? So I'll take the next slide, please. We want to move away from this external locus of control existence where everything else is done for us. And we want to say, well, how did we get here in the first place? How was this emotion, how did it even come to be? And we could say, I was created this way. How many people say, that's my nature. It's not my fault. I was born this way. Well, you know what the Torah has to say about that? It'll first give you the excuse. And it'll say, Vayivra Elohim et ha'adam betzalmo, betzelem Elohim bara'oto. The word selem means in the shadow of God. So of course, I'm in God's shadow. He's controlling me. I am just a puppet. I can do nothing. I'll take the next slide, please. Yeah, we were created that way, originally. But there was more to our creation than just being a puppet on a string. Because God told us specifically, Beni Bechori Yisrael. You are my firstborn child. And yes, I may have fashioned you out of earth and water, but eventually, what was my plan for you? Eventually, what do you think we've been reading? All those thousands of pages from the beginning of Bereshit. That was God's way of saying, I can make you, and I could create you, but if you want to be a real child, if you want to be a real boy, what do you have to do? You have to listen. And you have to, and I use this, you have to prove yourself. You have to be brave. You have to be truthful. You have to be unselfish. This is what the Torah is all about. It's about becoming a person that's able to cultivate an internal locus of control so that our spirit that God breathed into us is what's controlling us. I'll take the next slide, please. And how do we know that we have this spirit? Next slide, please. How do we know that we have the spirit? Because God made us that way. We forgot to read the next part, the next phase. Yes, originally we were made of wood like Pinocchio. But the second phase of our creation, what happens? God breathes his breath into us. We have the divine breath inside of us. And as long as we think we are not in control, then we're behaving like what? Like a puppet on a string. But if we want to recognize our divinity, our greatness, and our godliness, then that's what's going to make us Beni Bechori Yisrael. That's what's going to take us to the next level. I'll take the next slide, please. And part of getting to that next phase, and there's so few areas in the text where it speaks of hope. This is the closest thing we have to hope in the text. Chastei Hashem chadashim chelki. God's chesed, because of that, we do not perish. Every day, it's renewed, and my soul says, God is my birthright. Well, what does that mean to us? It means that every day we have to take action. And we have to be people of chesed to mirror God. And we have to every day renew our faith. It's not something that we wake up in the morning and we just feel inspired and we just feel empowered. We have to plug it in and recharge it all the time. And we have to realize that it's our birthright, that that is God's gift to us. I'll take the next slide. And the language that we need to develop, this is for my dad. He always used to say, and yet, no matter what happens, the party's over, and yet. And yet means we need to develop a narrative that says, yes, everything could be tumbling around us. What does and yet mean? And yet means I still have something, a role that I could play to change or move the story forward. I'll take the next slide, please. I didn't mention that the book of Echa was written in first person. How do we get to a place where we are able to realize our greatness, we have to start using words like I. We have to start using words like we. It's written in the first person, and God doesn't speak at all. We don't hear his voice. You know why we don't hear the voice of God? Because it's God contracting and saying, I said enough, you heard my voice, now it's time for me to hear your voice. And that contraction is what's going to bring us the greatest hope. I'll take the next slide, and this is the last slide. Eliyahu Navi wants to experience God. And you know what he says? God says he brings a strong wind, and he brings thunder, and he brings fire. And God says, I'm not in the thunder, I'm not in the wind, and I'm not in the fire. You know where I am? In the smallest of spaces, in the smallest of places. I am that kol demama daka. I am that quiet voice. You know how every hero has a villain? You know what the villain is there to do? The hero, and why do we all have heroes, and why do our kids love heroes? Is because the heroes depict for us the greatness that we can be, and everybody wants that. And you know what the villain always tries to do? It tries not just to silence the voice, it tries to silence the entire person. And God is saying, Kol demamadaka. You want to move on to the next level? You want to take the next step? It's time for you to start to listen to the inner voice, the voice that's speaking to you constantly. We can call that voice our conscience, our inner voice. It's our own personal prophecy. It's the voice of God that's speaking to us. And in order to have a strong internal locus of control, we need to be able to celebrate that voice. I'll take the final slide. And with this I end, and I pray that that little voice inside of us that's beckoning us to be greater than we ever imagined we ever could be is the voice that's going to take us to the next step, is the voice that's going to tell us, stop crying, start building. It's the voice that's going to tell us that you can do much more than you know you can, and it's the voice, God willing, that will bring our final redemption. Tish'a BeAb. Amen.